Welcome to the ReModelUN podcast. We're here live from the Learning Planet Institute is right in the heart of Paris, France. It's an amazing institute in terms of connection with UNESCO and the United Nations. And so it's a perfect place to look at how we could remodel the UN, starting with youth, starting with education. I'm François Grey. I'm your host. I'm from the University of Geneva. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. So we've just come back from a delicious lunch in a little Paris restaurant around the corner from the Learning Planet Institute. And we were talking about who we are and the fact that you are what you eat to some extent. So tell us who you are, each of you, so our listeners know a little bit about you before we start deep diving here through something you eat. I'm going to ask you, Noor, who you are.
Okay, so I'm Noor, and if I were to think of the connection between who I am and what I eat, it's definitely that I'm a person who enjoys change. I enjoy new things, I enjoy new projects, and I also love meeting new people, learning new things, because I have changed my ways of eating so many times, and I've tried so many different cuisines, and I'm very open to change. I think that would summarize my personality very well.
Fantastic. And here at LPI, what is your role?
Okay, and this also reflects my love for change and for learning. And this also reflects my love for change and mostly for learning, really. And it's because I have this background in linguistics, and then I started becoming curious about how could machines understand human language? What could be that interface that I moved into computer science and the marriage of the two, that is natural language processing. And then I thought, wait, but it's interesting to build tools, but who's going to use them and what is their need? And I wanted to have that connection as well, that I moved into then being a product manager and joining the LPI as a product manager on weLearn, which is our learning platform for the SDGs.
Thank you, Noor. François Taddei, who are you and what do you eat that makes you?
Maybe olive oil it's something that is produced, has been produced by my ancestors for hundreds of years, maybe even more. We have the same family house and we have a 1,000-year-old olive tree in the garden. So, I believe that I'm somewhat deeply rooted. And so my roots are nourished by this olive oil. I love to facilitate. I love to explore as well, so very much more. I'm here Chief Exploration Officer, which is another form of CEO because I was not very good at executing anything or anyone. And so I guess I'm a dreamer. And I hope I'm not the only one. And I'm trying to connect to other dreamers and trying to see what we can do together that I cannot do alone.
I'd like to start with Mohanty, who is part of the team here that's running these podcasts. This was sparked by the UN Datathon, which you were involved in. Can you say a few words about how you can go very quickly to a practical solution that changed the UN?
Yeah, it was an interesting example because that's when I realized, we have been working on these RAGs in general. We kind of almost treat it like a solved problem. So when many of the people at the hackathon who were from the UN organizations who came up with the problem, and we just quickly demoed a RAG solution, and then the amount of value it brought to them, it was very interesting for us to realize, there's something in there in being able to clearly map these problems to concrete technical solutions so that individuals from both the ends can benefit.
Right. And that went on to be a tool that they've deployed for the COP negotiations, which UNFCCC organizes. So it's really impact going straight from a hackathon with students to the UN changing the way it uses technology, and in particular adopting AI big time. Now that was 18 months ago. That's a long time in the history of AI. More recently, about 9 months ago, Noor, you joined us in Geneva for the Geneva Trialogue. And there you worked with the UN Library, and a similar experience of going from nothing at all to a practical result in the period of a day. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so the Geneva Trialogue really was the occasion to see big ideas and also resources that we have come together to provide, like what you said, Mohanty, a concrete tool that responds to a specific need. So in this case, it was super interesting because we're working on the archive from the League of Nations, which can be very powerful data when we look at it. It's like very tangible pieces of history that we have in our hands. And combining that with cutting edge technology and seeing how it can serve students was such a nice thing to do and to see.
Can you mention like some of the historical documents that really wowed you?
Well, it was really nice to see handwritten letters between diplomats that were dispatched in different parts of the world, mandates on different parts of the world that weren't necessarily countries yet, and seeing the exchange of power really happening in real time.
Yeah, it was really an experimental period for multilateralism, and goodness knows we may be coming back into a new experimental period of something lateralism. So, François, we're here because of you and because of the links that you have with the UN, and in particular the SDG Olympiad that we ran just a few months ago here at the LPI. Can you help us to connect the dots here between the UN and the SDG Olympiad and what you're doing these days at the LPI?
I think the common thread is young people. And the young people have not always been very central to the UN processes, even though when the League of Nations was started, a model League of Nations was started that predate the model UN, but it's more the students empowered by the idea that decided to do that. The UN Secretary General summarized this problem pretty well a few years ago. He was saying during General Assembly in 2022, there's 4 ways to interact with youth. The first is to ignore them. The second is to pretend to listen to them. And he said the UN and many other organizations have done this for much too long. The third way is to have a dialogue with youth. And the fourth, which remained to be invented, according to him, is to co-construct a future with youth. And so what we're trying to do here, we started very small, but everything we've done was co-designed by youth for youth. And, that helped us to grow exponentially, doubling in times quite a few times in the last 20 years. And now we are trying to take it one step further. So working with UNESCO, with United Nations University and many others, we're trying to see how we can bridge the conversation and make that co-construction possible between what next generation wants and what the UN wants. And actually, the last General Assembly led to the Pact for the Future, and the Pact for the Future says that we have to do 2 things that are important enough that they are an appendix in that Pact for the Future. The first one is to use your AI for the common good. And the second is to serve the next generation's best interest. And so how can we serve the next generation best interest, if not by listening to the current next generation and try to have a dialogue? So, trying to hack Model UN and have a conversation that can connect the youth needs and the UN needs, and using technology and pedagogies to do that bridge. That's basically what we're trying to talk about here.
Now, today we're going to deep dive into some ideas of how to help a certain group of young people around the world, people who do Model United Nations. This is the ReModelUN podcast, very much influenced by the agenda of the MUN community worldwide. So we're looking at how we can, using these podcasts, help students to solve problems that their teachers don't know how to solve, right? So we're really aiming high. And we're looking at challenge-based learning. And the first step in challenge-based learning is having a good problem definition. So we're going to try and dig into a few problems that are really relevant for the Model United Nations today. Well, Mohanty, this is an idea coming from AIcrowd. Can you say just in a nutshell why AIcrowd is interested in this kind of podcast?
For me, the key motivation is around this observation that we know that there's hundreds of thousands of highly motivated people who are really good around different aspects of technology and AI, who are willing to kind of go ahead and go really deep and solve some of these problems. And at the same time, we know there's thousands of problems affecting billions of people which exist across this UN ecosystem, a place where I have grew up in the last 10 years. But then clearly you don't see that mapping happening. And that is a translation problem. A lot of these problems are not translated into a particular way that these hundreds of thousands of AI researchers can work on them because they do not really understand. So we set out on a mission that can we talk to as many people who deeply understand these problems as we can, and then try to act as the translators to quantify these problems into an ontology of well-defined problems that we can open it up to a larger community of AI researchers and technical individuals who want to actually come ahead and help solve these problems.
Great. So we're essentially open sourcing problem definitions that students can use, but many other people can take up. And the challenges we're going to be talking about have different levels of complexity. And we have around the table people who are going to give us some insight on that. We want you to walk away or leave this podcast with a clear idea of where you could actually move the dial. So we're going to start right away with, I think, one challenge that really appeals to you, François, which is how can we take the data that's produced by Model United Nations events and use it to inspire the United Nations themselves.
So Model UN is a fantastic place where millions of students across the years have started to think about what they can do if they had a magic wand to change the world. But unfortunately, most of those conversations died at the end of that exercise, which is somewhat frustrating for the students. And in the meantime, as I was saying before, the UN would like to know next generation's perspective. So we're trying to build a bridge between the two. So can we collect all the students' ID? Can that feed some of the questions that UN is asking to the world? And can it start this co-construction dialogue that the Secretary General is asking for? And so if Model UN were connected by a platform, typically an AI platform these days, and the AI could do several things. The AI could help the students have a clearer understanding of what the UN has done in the past, of the various perspectives of the various countries, of the science behind the issue that they discuss. So that's to help them prepare. The AI can help them have a more meaningful dialogue and a better synthesis of it. There is some experiments that have been done recently that have shown that if you do a citizen participatory conference and ask for a synthesis of this, when you ask humans to make the synthesis or an AI to make the synthesis, and then you randomly give it to the participants tend to prefer the AI version, okay, which is somewhat surprising, maybe, but interesting in itself. And just because, humans are biased, not that AI is not, but humans are more biased than machines to make the synthesis at least. So you could use the AI to do the synthesis of the Model UN conferences and conversations, and then you can do this locally, but you can do this in different places, and then you can make the synthesis of the synthesis, and then you can bring all of this all the way up to a UN body that is interested in having that crowd distribution of ideas. And then imagine if the UN would end up saying, oh, that's a very interesting proposition. We had not thought of this. Why not implementing it? So imagine if, at least one of those proposals that many students across the world are doing can have an impact that will then impact everyone else on the planet.
Yes, I think that really is the arc of a theory of change that goes from a Model UN event to actually having some effect on how the UN behaves. There are many steps on the way there, and to kind of take that apart technically, Mohanty, what do you see as the challenges on that arc of transformation?
If we spoke about this just 5 or 6 years ago, that would be just a dreamer's long-term dream. But now it's an engineer's responsibility. We know how to make this happen. Why does it not happen right now? All these millions of students who are spending that much time preparing for it, having all these conversations, why do these conversations just go to die at the end of the MUN? And in terms of challenges, I think it's a question of course, the coordination. How do you basically coordinate across these many MUNs to be able to kind of share the data from the conversations? And once we have the data, the question of how do we, in an very much like an inverted pyramid, how do we slowly distill all that information out? Having something concrete in the short term where an analyst at the UN, depending on different perspectives, could just gather the overall opinions that are discussed across all these MUNs on a specific topic that they care about. Very much.
And Noor, I was curious from your point of view, you're actually building tools like this. You're a product manager. One very cool tool is weLearn here at LPI, and we'll hear more about that later. But when you hear a problem like this described, probably going through your head is a sense of what would your first step be? How long would you plan to set this up? And what sort of pitfalls would you try to avoid? Because everybody builds platforms, but very few of them actually get used in the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we mentioned how there seems to be a translation problem between real world needs and use cases and what engineers are building or their thought process or AI research in the direction that it's going in. And of course, there is this gap, but then I think even beyond the translation problem, or something that I think even beyond the translation problem, I think even beyond the translation problem, or something that feeds into it, is a lack of interdisciplinarity on both sides. So I will recount my own personal experience of why I think this is important and how I arrived into natural language processing. I really came from this fusion of linguistics and computer science. You could come from it from the engineering side of things purely and go into building models, but I've realized that what happens in that case is we tend to neglect the data. And we tend to say the data collection, cleaning, and all of that kind of thing should be the responsibility of, let's say, a linguist or a psychologist that knows more about this kind of thing. But then when we build the model and when we observe a specific behavior that the model is outputting, it actually becomes harder to link that to the input data and think, okay, because in my input data I've had this inconsistency or I've had this error that's come up often, that's why my model is outputting this. And coming from this inter or pluridisciplinary background, I've been able to do both, as in building the model, but also understanding what kind of data we need and how the data is influencing the model. I'm saying the students that are part of MUN and participating and generating MUN resolutions, their data can be used by AI researchers or engineers to build models that would analyze them. It's also giving them a minimal understanding of building AI models in order to allow them to envision and actually have a mental model of what this kind of data could look like in order to solve this problem. And not just externalizing solving the problem to a specific set of people and then having like data production being disconnected from it. We do need to introduce this idea of having a plurality of opinions or perspectives that are represented. I think this is why I'm talking about interdisciplinarity, because it intrinsically starts to include diverse opinions when you have people with different backgrounds working on the same problem. And I think the idea here is, if we were to tackle something that seems so broad and would need to address different people and also come from different people, I think it's also accepting that we start with a minimal version and that we build on it. And starting with that minimal version, I think being in action also creates inspiration, and then you see more options. And then at the end, you start developing it, and that starts to vary and it starts to take shape, and then you have variations. I think you need to start with, what is the minimal step that I can take now to start building a solution?
Fantastic. And François, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I feel that I like the pyramid perspective that you describe. Obviously, if there is no drop into the transfer of information. But I think we should also think about this as a network. Okay, so for instance, students that are doing ModelUN in one place may be very interested in other students' perspective in another place. Okay, and the very reason why universities have been amazing places for centuries is because this is a place where you document what you do, you publish it, you share it, and so you enable others to learn from you. You know, the famous sentence comes from this: if you want to see far, you have to climb on the shoulders of giants. So that pyramid can be climbed by many, many different people. Okay, they can see the other's perspective and they can learn from it. Maybe a philanthropist would like the idea and would like to fund it. Maybe a local mayor would love the idea and would like to implement it in their town. And so I think it can feed many conversations. It can maybe feed even younger ones that, you know, it's inspired their imagination and they want to make this idea come true and they want to build a movement to make that happen. So I think it's very important that those conversations do not get lost and that they are fostered by technology and they are powered to be heard and searchable easily by others. And so that can fuel a sort of a global conversations starting from the local MUNs that are happening in different places.
So we've covered this whole idea of taking a huge amount of data from Model United Nations, from what young people are thinking, and figuring out how to get it into the UN so that it makes some kind of change in the spirit of the new spirit of the UN that doesn't just want to pretend to listen, but actually wants to act on those ideas. Now, let's look at another point that is key to the ReModelUN philosophy, which is better Model UN experiences in high schools and universities and so on, that the students could be informed by much more information than they can find just out there on the internet. Sure, Wikipedia is great, but UN has tons of archival data, and if presented the right way, if digested the right way, will give amazing insights. So Noor, you had an experience in Geneva working with the UN Library on that. What can you imagine also with the weLearn platform you're working, what could really work in terms of getting archival data from the UN into the hands of young people in a meaningful way?
Having also participated at MUN conferences when I was in high school, it was very clear to me when I had joined that table at the Geneva Trialogue how important it was to assist the research process for MUN delegates and chairs, because that really is the most time-consuming part. You're assigned a country usually, you're assigned a council, and then you have to accomplish a great deal of research in order to be effective in your role as delegate for that country. Sometimes it's not very feasible also, so there is some improvisation that comes into play, and this is where MUN also helps develop soft skills and not just research and geopolitical knowledge. Joining this table at the Geneva Trialogue, where we worked on taking this archival data that has been digitalized, so it's League of Nations data, historical data spanning several decades, I believe. The project that was undertaken, which was huge, was to scan all of this data and have it all available online. But the next step is, what do we do now? After having done all of this work of digitalizing it, how do we really harness the value of it? So we decided to implement a quick solution that we could show results for at the end of the day, and that's what we did. And it was really interesting because we took all of these files, so they were PDF files, usually scanned, manuscripts, letters from here to there, notes from different meetings, notes from different summits, and what we did is we had an AI model look at them, analyze them, and then we asked different questions, contextualizing it within the context of a MUN delegate, within the context of an MUN delegate. And we found that having put ourselves in the skin of an MUN delegate that had to do research for a specific resolution, and at the same time being able to query historical data, that was very powerful, because not being born at that time, not having lived through these historical events, things seem a bit disconnected today. And just being able to very quickly and very effectively summarize large quantities of data and extract the information that really matters for that person in that use case, specifically a student representing a country in MUN, was just a huge help.
Really, there's so much potential, because that's just one archive. And of course, it seems like old history, the League of Nations, but it was a very creative period of multilateralism. And surprisingly, many things that we take for granted today were invented at that time. So that's one example. If we come into recent era of UN development of archival data, and if we move away from just textual data, Mohanty, you've looked at the Humanitarian Data Exchange, for example, which is a huge database of humanitarian data in more, I would say, digital format, not text, but numbers. How could that be used for NUM debates, do you think? Because that's a step away from what most MUN debates are about.
Kind of approaches we will use to analyze data sets like that will stay the same, because again, right now the multimodal models are getting as good as normal text-based language models, and then that gap will only keep decreasing over time. The question I would ask is, like, what are the kind of questions we can ask right now on data sets like these, the ones from UN Archive or the rich amounts of data sets on HDX? The basic horizon of the kind of questions we could ask just a few years ago that has expanded exponentially over the years is only expanding. the kind of things we can do. For example, if I have the whole data set of the UN archive, I want to understand little trends of how did this particular idea change across many little generations over to become this particular resolution. You can literally have a little army of agents which you can let loose on these data sets, and they iteratively work with each other to figure out this genealogy of ideas until this resolution came forward. So questions like these would need an army of thousands of PhD students that you have to let loose on the whole data set, the whole of the UN archives to even think about answering. Now, a few researchers over a weekend technically could actually put together a system like this, but we just do not have enough people asking questions, imagining the possibility that you have an army of agents, and your job is to figure out what ambitious question you can ask. Second, how do you build this architecture of agents that you can let loose?
Fantastic. François, looking at this from the point of view of youth, and you mentioned how much that's the core of what you think about at Learning Planet Institute, how are we ever going to convince all these millions of young people who love MUN but are often not the most techie of the students in schools? How are we going to convince them to use this technology?
I think the first thing is to co-design the solutions with them, for them. Okay, so if you have someone like Mohanty that is somewhere at the service of these young people to help them have the tools and the interfaces that they need in order to do their work, and then benefit from these thousands of agents that will be working for them, I think that's one way of doing it. The second is to tell them that they can not only analyze the traces of the past, they can start making history today. Okay? And I think that's a very powerful lesson from history, is that history is never predictable. Every one of us can play a role in making history. If you look at history, you can start learning that young woman called Eglantine Jebb, back then, 100 years ago, wrote the first declarations of children's rights. And she convinced the League of Nations back then to implement a policy that will be more human for every kid. Okay, so that's the sort of things, if you start seeing this, then you can be inspired. I could be the next Eglantine Jebb. Okay, I could learn on her footstep, and I could try to understand from this archive what's the magic of her ability to convince, elder men that they should care about children. Because today maybe what's needed is to convince elder men that they have to listen about next generation's best interest. So I think learning from this historical perspective could be profoundly transformative, because you could see that, for instance, one of the things she did is she started to use all the communication tools that were available back then in the 20s of the past century. Okay, she used cinema, radio, she used different ways and media to try to promote her ideas. And that's the way she was able to convince to create that first children's rights declarations. How would we upgrade it today? How we get the voices of the children? Because back then it's an adult that wrote it. What if it was the youth of today that was writing the next generations?
This whole approach to looking at the sort of big data from MUN and big data from the UN will teach us many other things. What could be cool things that you could do with this data, Mohanty?
There's just too many very interesting things that you can actually try in a setup like this, because it's a very ideal setup. It's a safe simulation of how many of the key elements in society that we care about. There's individuals who have a vested interest in it. They basically want to really win in this gamified setup. They come in well prepared. They have clear, well-defined roles that we can assign and then also swap. Then they negotiate, they cooperate, they compete. Many of these classic elements of a real-world human societal setup that we have. Now, a lot of my interests are clearly around AI research. That is what I think about all the time. And I can think of so many examples. One of them could simply be around this example that we have been talking about around AI safety. Ages ago, since it was in 2018 when researchers asked, when we have superhuman AI, and how do we even figure out which AI is more aligned with us and which AI is not, when they're talking about a topic with that much depth that we will never be able to understand. So someone basically suggested, it was actually a paper by the current founders of Anthropic when they were at OpenAI, where they say they build upon the idea that it is easier to detect a lie than to lie. And so they get both these superhuman AIs to debate with each other. And the human judge has a much higher chance to be able to detect which AI is more aligned with them than the other one. And that could happen in games of chess, mathematical reasoning, and many other real-world setups. And MUN could actually be a great place to just test that out, example out in a large-scale way, where we have expert humans interacting with other AI agents. And we have superhuman AI agents who deeply understand a particular resolution, debate with each other, and have a human judge be able to say, okay, which one is a little bit more aligned with us and which one is not. Or we mix and match. But that data set would be something I would be really curious to look at closely. To be able to answer many important fundamental questions that society has to answer, right? How do you align superhuman AIs? Or you could ask completely other questions. So now everyone's talking about AI assistants and how AI assistants are going to be amazing for society. But do we really know how much of value add are AI agents adding to a negotiation? How much of value add are AI agents adding to a conflict? So on and so forth. Many of these things are things we can objectively measure in a safe simulated environment where the incentives of all the characters in the whole setup align. So that's why it's an interesting thing to see how the whole thing evolves.
Right. Noor, a bit about weLearn and how you see weLearn playing along with this type of approach.
So weLearn is a platform that we've developed here at the LPI. And the basis of weLearn is really how can we take advanced technologies, so AI, but then also other algorithms, and put them in service of education, and more specifically, education for sustainability, education for the SDGs. We have a vector database in which we've compiled around 500,000 different resources that we've filtered based on their relevance to the SDGs. So it's a very focused approach where we allow access to a large amount of data that is focused on the SDGs. And then what we work on is how can we think of innovative features that are sometimes LLM-based, but not always, in order to extract as much value as we can from this digital database, from this digital information, basically, and to provide value when it comes to learning and teaching about sustainability. So it really is how do we extract data in a way that's effective, in a way that's easier, and in a way that puts education about sustainability in the forefront. And one of our challenges that I really think of often is this idea of unification, because especially when we think about how it's not that accessible yet to be building large language models at a large scale in terms of just constraints of resources, but also skills. Most tools, I would say, tend to use this limited number of LLM models that are developed by some companies or some organizations. So one of our huge challenges is going to be how do we keep the plurality of opinions, and how do we conserve diversity and also tolerance for differences? So this really is a reflection also of what we need in society, I believe, especially when we go back to the basis of AI models, which is based on data that's produced in the real world. We're producing a model that is then potentially reproducing that data. So if there are some kind of injustices or bias, then that is potentially reproduced. So one of the challenges is also going to be how do we deal with plurality in the input, but also in the output. So in the input, having something that's having something that's representative, inclusive, and in the output, having outputs that address different categories of people, different needs, different use cases appropriately. And if we were to consider the MUN, if we were going to consider this in the context of MUN, in the MUN distributed model, we have lots of different conferences across the globe. And so we have a diversity of input in our data, right? We have people that are setting up their conferences, and then they're producing different resolutions that are not necessarily linked or have different perspectives. So how can we, so different countries in the UN that can benefit from this conference data, so there's this diversity of output. So how can we conserve those? I don't have the answer. Is it going to be developing lots of different models, each of them representing an idea? Or is there something deeper in terms of technology that can actually handle all of this diversity? And one final thing I think I would love to talk about is the concept of frugality. So this also comes back to knowledge of the field. It's very easy now to take an LLM and have it do a bunch of things and be like, cool, it's doing it really well. But I think when we're building and what we're doing in weLearn is we're taking into account the fact that we can also use different models. So we can develop a text classification model that's specific, that's smaller, that's lighter, that's going to do our task very well. We don't need to employ an LLM here. We can do it for things like translation, for language detection. So whenever possible, thinking about what would be the frugal approach here and when can I actually employ a larger AI model where it really makes sense and where I really see the value.
Thank you. I think that's really important for our listeners to think about how they can do a lot with a little. They don't need to have the best tools. We hope that people doing MUNs in schools that don't necessarily have a lot of support will still be able to benefit from these ideas and go on to build things that are useful for them. François, weLearn and young people like Noor who are doing brilliant work in your lab here, how does this all fit into the Learning Planet Institute's sort of overall goals in transforming education, and how do you manage to do this in collaboration with UNESCO and UN University?
We are blessed to have people like Noor and many young people that want to make a difference that joined us. And that's, I guess, the reason, because we co-design with them, for them, over the last 20 years, we were able to grow exponentially. And, when we grew enough, we became visible for institutions. And so what we did is we basically created a middle ground that is at the interface between the youth's voices and needs and the institution's expectations. And we try to see if there is something through that middle ground that can be done, that cannot be done directly between the upper ground institutional perspective and the underground activist perspective. So I think that's one way to create values, is understand the needs and resource of the individuals, the needs and resource of the collective, the needs and resource of the institution, the needs and resource of the planet, and try to see if there is a possible alignment. And what's interesting is that in this AI age, this needs and resource can be more systematically explored and matched. So for instance, we've developed an AI tool that is not answering to your question, it's questioning you and helping you to find what's called the ikigai, which is the intersection between your need and resource, the needs and resource of your community, the needs and resource of the planet, and helps you to identify your passion, helps you to identify your vocation, your mission, your profession, by inviting you to input what you love, what you believe the world needs, what you know how to do, you could learn, and the resources you can mobilize around you, including a salary and a job. So that's something we've been able to design here with talented students that wanted to push that frontier. And now we can go further because we can help students design their own AI tools that can help them explore what's truly deeply meaningful to them, help them to maybe reconnect to their inner self, connect to others, connect to the planet, so that they can go from an attitude that is unfortunately too common of dominating self, dominating others, dominating the planet, to one where you learn to care for self, care for others, care for the planet. So that's typically the sort of exercise we try to do. And if we do this with the legitimacy of the UNESCO and the United Nations University, and we give credit to students that don't want to be the best in the world in the rat race for exams, but want to become the best for the world, where they want to learn not to compete with others on yesterday's knowledge, but they want to cooperate on today's challenge to build tomorrow. So that's typically what we're trying to do here. And fortunately, ever more people are aligning to this perspective, and that's the way we manage to gather resource and legitimacy, and we'd like to scale this now, not just to the happy few that are in this building, but thanks to the technology we've been discussing, make this accessible, say, to a woman in Afghanistan, or to a refugee that cannot leave the camp, or to a student that lives in a country where some knowledge is not supposed to be taught. Okay? Some people move backward. They are reinventing the dark ages, as you were saying, and I think we have to reinvent the Enlightenment. It's a conversation about how can we mobilize the collective to collectively discuss complex issues and come up with solutions. So I think having conversations about conversation is very important, because the social networks have actually destroyed the trust in conversation. People start to fear each other's reaction online and even face-to-face. So we have to restore the art of the conversation in the AI age, in the planetary age. And that's, I think, what we are discussing. And it's very important because meaningful conversations are the basis of democracy, of education, of citizenship, and of living together, really. Okay, since discussing around the fire as a tribe, we've started to have those conversations to decide collectively what it is that is meaningful to us and that we want to build, so that together we can do something that we cannot do alone.
Fantastic. And I think this leads us into the last deep dive we wanted to do, which is, Learning Planet Institute, as we just heard, is doing an amazing job of lifting up through technology the ability of people to work together. How are we going to take that the next level to the planetary scale and maybe interplanetary while we're at it? So, Mohanty, what do you think about that? What are the steps for scaling up what we're talking about here?
We want the ability to listen to all the voices in their rawest form, figure out a clean, clear way in which we can distill it down across different layers into knowledge that can finally affect the decisions which complete the loop, right? And technically speaking, again, right now we do have fairly noisy forms of doing that. You listen in on Twitter and then you get a sentiment of what the whole country is feeling and what individuals are feeling, what communities are feeling, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, it is still a very noisy signal. Can we imagine more well-defined, well-structured participatory conversation platforms, where I think we were talking earlier about the importance of figuring out how to reduce the noise in that signal. For example, imagine a Twitter where, as François had suggested, imagine conversations where everyone is forced to introspect before they can speak. Imagine a Twitter where everyone is forced to introspect before they can tweet. What is the quality of that signal? What can we learn from that? Because then once you have these conversations happening, either these could be conversations we are passively listening in, or conversations which we initiate by concretely asking a specific participatory question to every single individual that it affects. Very much like you have direct democracy in Switzerland, but imagine the manageable version of it at the planetary scale. And we aggregate all the different dimensions of the conversations, not just to a yes or no about a resolution, but all the intricate dimensions of that conversation into a well-detailed set of reports, which again, this report itself, very much like in context of MUNs, does not necessarily actually have to be an inverted pyramid. But then to be able to do that, I think we have to really kind of focus, put our heads down and get the MUN level version of that problem right.
So we have to start from somewhere. One of the places to start is with weLearn. Noor, you're the product manager there. How do you see a product like weLearn scaling up step by step to reach that kind of planetary impact?
Okay, before thinking of scaling up, I think we need to scale down. So what I've realized is we're talking about how can we create fairer models, inclusive models that represent a plurality of people, of opinions. And I think we can't create something that we don't already embody. And this is why I'm talking about scaling down, because when we're thinking of, let's say, children, toddlers, babies, it's this idea of mirror neurons with adults or their caregivers, where it's not really what you tell the baby or the toddler or the child to do. It's what they see you do and how they see you act in the world that they will actually integrate, and they will start behaving in the same way that they see you behave. And we're building these models, and at the same time, I think there is perhaps space in humanity to develop more of this active listening, to take the time to give space for others to express themselves and to just hold that space before trying to react or to think of something to say. And I think once we focus on that and put the human back into the center of everything that we're building, be it in education with weLearn and specifically education for sustainability, that's what's going to allow us to empower a lot of people and have this bottom-up approach that's going to scale very naturally.
I think it's a beautiful vision and one that's, I think, very well aligned with MUNs. François, as we scale up to the planet, maybe to galactic levels as well, what should we be looking out for?
I really appreciate what you just said. And I think knowing where we come from, understanding is helping us to understand where we are, and it is helping us to dream of where we want to be. We have a culture of care, but unfortunately also a culture of domination that is associated with this. Because sometimes some of the adults are not as caring as they could have been towards the youngest ones. Sometimes because they don't understand the needs of the youngest ones, sometimes for more perverse reasons, partly because they've themselves suffered early on. So healing selves can help us heal our relation to others and our relation to nature. And understanding where we come from then can help us build a more holistic and a more caring future where, we can build for future generations in mind as well. Okay? Can we learn to become good ancestors? Can we learn so that our impact on the 22nd or 21st century would be a positive one? Okay? And what would that mean? So if you start, like Mohanty was saying, before you start tweeting or discussing, reacting or overreacting, if you were to reflect on where do I come from, where am I, where do I want to go, and what trace I want to leave to my children and grandchildren, what would they think of my contribution to the world and to the future generations? I think that would be quite potent. And what I believe is that these ModelUN conversations are indeed little prototype, little toy circumstances where we can experiment and we can all learn. I think, for learners that are in ModelUN, it's very often the most eye-opening learning experience they had. But what if it could be a learning experience for everyone on the planet? Because everyone can benefit from these little prototypes. Because this is a way of learning to decide what we want for the future. Okay? And you can do this in your family conversation, you can do this in your village conversation, you can do this in your regional conversation, national conversation, and planetary conversation. And maybe tomorrow, galactic conversation. But at the moment, I think the level of interdependence is we've learned to go from the family level to the tribe level to the city level to the nation level. Now we have to move to the planetary level. I love to facilitate. I love to explore as well, so very much Noor. I'm here Chief Exploration Officer, which is another form of CEO because I was not very good at executing anything or anyone. And so I basically, I guess I'm a dreamer, and I hope I'm not the only one. And I'm trying to connect to other dreamers and trying to see what we can do together that I cannot do alone.
Fantastic. Thank you, François. Thank you, Noor. Mohanty, this was amazing podcast in the ReModelUN series. Looking forward to continuing our conversations back in Geneva. Have a great day.